In our last lecture, we looked at the myth of King Arthur as part of our ongoing consideration of the monomyth. This time we want to do the same thing with a very famous Greek myth, Jason and the Argonauts. Generally, we're not doing very much with Greek and Roman myths in this course because they've already been done in another teaching company course. But this one is such a good illustration of the monomyth, and it also illustrates, I think, some of the theses about the goddess from last unit that it's too good to pass up. I also have a kind of personal resonance for this story. In my second year of high school Latin, this was our year-long project to translate a Latin translation of Jason and the Argonauts. As a second-year Latin student, we were interested in a lot of things like syntax and grammar and looking for those ablative absolutes, but a lot of the good parts of the story came through anyway. I particularly remember the episode with the harpies. The story seems to have been very well known in its own day. It's referred to by Hesiod, the Greek poet, in the 8th century BCE, and by Homer at about the same time. In Book 12 of the Odyssey, in fact, Circe tells Odysseus about the Symplegades. These are rocks that crash together like cymbals each time a ship tries to pass between them. She says this to Odysseus: "Only one ocean-going craft, the far-famed Argo, made it, sailing from Aita. But she too would have crashed on the big rocks if Hera had not pulled her through for love of Jason, her captain." That far-famed makes it seem as though everyone reading Homer would have known this story as well. Pindar in the 5th century BCE tells a complete version in one of his odes, but that's quite different in that it foregrounds Jason and not Medea in the accomplishment of the tasks in Colchis. The best known version is that by Apollonius of Rhodes in the 3rd century BCE. It was probably a prose translation of that one that I was working on in my second year Latin class. Judging by the number of copies that have survived, in its day it was as well known as Homer's epics. There's a long background story about where the fleece came from, about how it wound up in Colchis, which is at the eastern edge of the Black Sea, and about the connections between Thessaly and Colchis. For us, the story begins when Peleus, the brother of Jason, who's the king of Iolcus in Thessaly, deposes his brother and usurps his throne. Shortly after the deposition, Aeson's wife gives birth to a son, Jason. The parents are worried that his uncle will try to kill him to prevent him from making a threat on the throne, so they take him up to the mountains where he's raised by Chiron, the centaur, the same one who will raise Achilles in the next generation. In fact, there's a really touching tableau that happens at the beginning of this poem. When Jason and the Argonauts are setting out on their voyage, while on shore, Chiron waves goodbye, holding the infant Achilles in his arms. When Jason is 20, he returns to Iolcus and demands his father's kingdom. Peleus pretends to acquiesce, but only under the condition that Jason will voyage to Colchis and bring back the Golden Fleece. Peleus is, at the moment, really trying to get rid of Jason without having to kill him himself, since he assumes that he's not going to make it back alive from this quest. Jason has Argus, the master shipbuilder, build a ship of 50 oars, and then he recruits an all-star cast to man it. All this happens about a generation before the Trojan War, so many of the crew are familiar to us from other myths. The crew includes Castor and Polydeuces, who are twin sons of Zeus by the mortal woman Leda, who is also by Zeus, the mother of Helen of Troy. Heracles himself started out on this voyage, but he was left behind when he went ashore looking for his cupbearer, Hylas, who had disappeared. Orpheus, the great singer who traveled to Hades to try to retrieve his lost wife Eurydice, is a crew member. So is Peleus, the father of Achilles, and many others. The crew is a kind of who's who of Greek semi-divines and heroes. And when the ship and the crew are ready, they depart for Colchis. They have many adventures along the way. At Lemnos in the Aegean, they find an island which is populated entirely by women. The women had killed all of their men folks and then taken over the island themselves. When the Argonauts arrive, they are both starved for love and worried about repopulation, so they invite the men to stay for a few months, so the Argonauts do. Jason becomes for a while the consort of Queen Hypsipyle, who then bears twin sons to him months after he leaves. In Cyzicus, on the southern shores of the Dardanelles, they are received very hospitably, But when they leave, the contrary winds blow them back at night, and the people of the city think that they're being attacked by pirates. They rush out to defend their city, and in the melee, because the Argonauts can't tell who they're fighting either, a lot of the local citizens are killed. That delays the trip a little bit because Jason insists that they stay long enough to hold funeral games for those who were killed in the process. On the south shore of the Black Sea, the ruler is a son of Poseidon who challenges anyone who lands on his shores to a boxing match to the death. Heracles would have been the obvious choice for this, but Heracles is already gone by this time, so Polydeuces steps in. They have their boxing match, and he manages to kill the ruler at his own game. At Salmydessus, they meet Phineus, a blind old man who'd been given the gift of seeing into the future by Apollo. Zeus was angered by Phineus's ability to tell people more than Zeus wants them to know, so he blinds the prophet and then sends against him the Harpies. These are these creatures with faces of hags and bodies and claws of birds who defile his food every time he tries to eat. It's been such a long time since he's been able to eat that by the time the Argonauts arrive, he's so thin that he seems a skeleton just covered with skin. Two sons of Boreas, the north wind, fly up to meet the Harpies the next time they show up. They meet them, defeat them, and free the old man from his curse. Phineus, who still has his gift of prophecy, tells Jason how to get through the Symplegades, those clashing rocks, which he does, as we remember Circe telling Odysseus. They have a lot of other adventures along the way, but they finally arrive at Colchis, where the real tasks begin. Jason's allies in Colchis are first Hera, who for reasons of her own wants the mission to succeed. She's angry with Peleus back in Iolcus, and she chooses this rather roundabout way to punish him. His other ally is Aphrodite, who's enlisted by Hera to help her. And what Aphrodite does is causes the daughter of the king of Colchis to fall madly, passionately, irrationally in love with Jason. This is Medea, and her story illustrates the kind of horrors involved in that sort of blind, irrational love. The chorus in Euripides' play, Medea will say later that if a little love is a good love, a kind of love, a calm love, a quiet love is like a hearth fire that warms the house, whereas the kind of love that Medea experiences for Jason is the kind that will burn the entire house down. At the time they say this, they are seeing a later stage in the Medea story and seeing what's happened to Medea because of this love for Jason, and so they know very well what they're talking about. Medea has to make a difficult choice in this poem. She has to choose between her father and her homeland on the one hand and her irresistible love for this handsome stranger on the other. Thanks to Aphrodite's intervention, she chooses to help Jason perform the tasks that her father sets Jason in order for him to win the fleece. The tasks look impossible. He has to yoke 2 fire-breathing, bronze-hoofed oxen and then use them to plow up a vast field with a stone plow, and then seed the furrows with dragon's teeth, and then kill the warriors who will spring up from those dragon teeth. Medea helps him in all of these tasks. She begins by restoring his youth. First, she puts him to sleep, then cuts him up into pieces and brews those pieces in a special potion of hers, and then recreates him. He emerges a new, revitalized man. She also, for that day of the trials, gives him an ointment that makes him invulnerable and coaches him in how to succeed, tell him how to get through all of these tasks her father has set. He does. He manages to succeed at all of these things, and by the time he does, the king of Colchis knows that he's been betrayed by his own daughter, and he vows revenge on her as well as on the Argonauts. Medea knows all of this too, so she helps Jason to find the Golden Fleece. When they find it, she puts the dragon who guards it to sleep with a spell, so Jason can simply pull it down from the tree. Then she kidnaps her little brother and makes a run for it with Jason. She knows she can't go home again. She's going to have to flee with Jason now. There are various accounts of what happens next, but in all of them, Jason and Medea kill her little brother. They do this either so that he can't grow up to avenge his father's defeat and the theft of the fleece, or he's killed and the pieces are scattered on the water behind the ship, so the pursuing king has to stop to pick up the pieces for burial, and that gives Jason and Medea time to escape. In all of the versions, Zeus is terrifically angered by this butchery, and he puts all kinds of troubles in the way of the homebound Argos. He gives other heroes, this gives other heroes a chance to do their thing and to shine, and there are many more heroic quests and achievements by the crew on the way home. On the way home, Medea gets to save Jason several more times. Years later, they finally arrive at Iolcus and home. We can't really stop the story here because the continuation of it, Euripides' play Medea, is, if anything, more famous than Apollonius's poem. Euripides' play was actually written before Apollonius's poem, and there were probably many other versions of the ending of this story which have been lost since that he could draw on. In the play, Jason and Medea arrive at Iolcus and demand the throne. Peleus refuses to turn it over. To punish him, Medea talks the daughters of Peleus into doing the same thing for her father that she had done for Jason. That is, cut him up into pieces, brew him in her special potion, and then let him emerge a new man. Everything works except that there's no reemergence this time. This time, he doesn't reemerge from that cauldron, and that's the end of Peleus. Jason and Medea now, of course, get banished to Corinth. They've been partly responsible now for the death of the king, and they're banished to Corinth. And in Euripides' version, they have two sons. This is the point at which Euripides' play actually begins. The king of Corinth offers his daughter Creusa as a wife to Jason, and then Jason will eventually inherit the kingdom. Jason accepts the offer, basing his decision on a law of Athens in 5th century BCE when and where the play was written that prevents his union with Medea from being a legal marriage, since she is an alien not born in Athens, not born locally. Medea has by this time given up everything for Jason, and now she faces the prospect of exile in a foreign land. We know that she can never go home again, so she takes a very grisly revenge on her husband. She sends Jason's new fiancée a robe, which when the fiancé puts it on, it kills her. Medea, remember, has great magical powers. And then when her father tries to save his daughter, the father too is killed when he tries to help. Then she kills her own and Jason's two sons as a way of getting back at Jason, and escapes all the consequences by flying off to Athens in a chariot drawn by dragons provided by her grandfather, Helios, the sun. Jason is left behind a totally destroyed man at this point. He has no heirs, he has no prospects, his life is in ruins. According to the most popular version of the story, he spends the rest of his life simply haunting the ruined and beached hulk of the old Argos, reliving the days of his youthful glory, every day just spending time remembering what it was like when he was young, until one day a rotting spar falls on him and kills him, and that's the end of Jason. The first thing to notice about Jason is that if he's not quite a second-rate hero, he's at least a somewhat tarnished one. This is partly because of that all-star crew that he gathered together, because they all need chances to show off on the voyages as well. They have many heroic feats that they perform, and so much of the heroism of the poem is not really Jason's, it belongs to members of his crew. Heracles rids a country of giants. The sons of Boreas defeat the Harpies. And all of this is repeated on the return trip, where these crew members have a chance to perform some pretty notable deeds. Even in Colchis, where he does the things for which he's best known, that is yoking the impossible oxen and plowing the impossible field and destroying the army of giant warriors, the credit really belongs more to Medea than it does to Jason. He couldn't have achieved any of this without her, nor could he have even taken the fleece without her putting the dragon to sleep, so that all he has to do is to reach out and take it. It's like pulling a towel off a rack. Apollonius, in his poem, notices how often Jason is full of fear and doubt, and notices how often Medea has to buck him up to keep him going. In Euripides' play, Jason says that Medea didn't do this for him, that Aphrodite made her do it. And even though there's a certain justice in this, technically there is a certain justice, we know this is true, it doesn't enhance Jason's status as a hero to hear him say it. In a way, I guess, Jason is perhaps more like a CEO than a hero in his own right. He's managing a crew of really talented people whose achievements he can, in some sense, claim for himself. Medea simply turns out to be the most talented of his allies. Still, Jason's career conforms pretty closely to the idea of the monomyth we've been carrying with us in the last 3 lectures. His birth is not miraculous. He seems to have been born in the normal way, but there are those efforts made by the father figure. Here, Peleus, his uncle, the king of Iolcus, there is an effort to kill him while he's young. So he's spirited away, and he's raised by an animal, or at least by a half an animal, Chiron, the centaur. This is a pretty straightforward version of Otto Rank's family romance, in which in the myth, the son projects onto the father the hostility that the son feels for his father. As a young man, he has to prove himself, to prove he partakes of that divine essence that Leeming mentions, which Jason does. When he's 20 years old, he walks back into Peleus' town and demands his father's throne back. There are even some divine portents. Peleus has had dreams warning him about a young man coming into town with only one shoe, and it turns out that Jason has lost one shoe crossing a river, so Peleus knows this is his adversary. This is the man he's been waiting for. Jason has already spent his time of isolation in the mountains, learning his destiny, and he meets the challenges of his departure with enthusiasm. That is, when the time comes for the departure for his trip to Colchis, he takes it on with enthusiasm. His departure from the safe world, we know, to the one that we don't know at all, is the first step in the quest. And here he sails into a region as remote and unknown as Mars would be for us if Mars were inhabited by hosts of fierce warriors. His quest is both for a place and an object, Colchis and the Golden Fleece, which he can bring back as a boon to revitalize his people. The fleece is his holy grail, or Gilgamesh's secret of eternal life. Along the way, he encounters many threshold guardians, many of those guardians who try to prevent the crossing of the threshold. He meets giants and dragons and harpies and evil kings, some of which he manages on his own, but many of which are handled by his all-star crew. He also meets along the way a femme fatale, Medea, but thanks to the intervention of Hera and Aphrodite, she turns out to be an ally rather than a temptation. We'll come back to this, since Medea's part in this story is so important, she needs some attention of her own, and we'll get back to her. Jason doesn't actually descend into the underworld, but he does die in the poem. He is put to sleep, chopped into pieces by Medea, brewed, and then he reemerges as a new man. So he does undergo a death in the course of the poem. In the monomyth, the point of this episode is the death of the old man and the rebirth of the new, and it does happen here. When Jason awakes, his fear and caution and apprehension for the time being are gone, and he looks forward to facing the challenges that lie ahead of him. The hero brings back a boon, which is, in this poem, is treated ironically. The community rejects the boon, that is the Golden Fleece, which Jason brings back. The community rejects the boon, or at least the king does. So then, because the community rejects the boon, Medea steps in and intervenes with another strong dose of magic, but this time it backfires. This time, because of the death of the king, Jason and Medea are banished to Corinth, and then the rest of their story plays itself out there. The hero in this poem, far from achieving an apotheosis like Arthur on his way to Avalon, or Jesus ascending into heaven, or Moses or Elijah or Enoch spirited away to God, or so far from achieving enlightenment like some kind of nirvana, this hero winds up spending his days roaming the wreck of his old ship, reliving the old days, remembering what it was like to be young and a hero, until that spar falls on him and kills him, and that's the end of his story. It's a really ironic ending, but the text comes pretty late in Greek history, which may have been a pretty ironic age itself. By the 3rd century, when Apollonius wrote this, we're past the conquests of Alexander the Great, and the Western world was in many ways a Greek domain by this time. In all parts of Alexander's empire, the Greeks would have been the ruling class, the elite class, and would have been a minority among aliens. Apollonius himself was the head librarian at that magnificent library of Alexandria in Egypt, which, partly because of the library, was the intellectual center of the entire Greek world. Until it was destroyed in the 1st century CE, that library at Alexandria contained virtually every written work of the classical age. Estimates range that between 100,000 and 700,000 volumes. They wouldn't have been volumes, they would have been scrolls actually. But estimates are between 100 and 700,000 scrolls in that library. And if you simply go to your own local library and compare the number of volumes held there and use that as a point of comparison, you can see what a magnificent library that must have been and what a treasure it was and how awful it was when it was lost. It was also a very civilized age. The values of this age, this post-Alexandrian age, were diplomacy and intelligence rather than physical prowess. The Greeks, in fact, mostly hired mercenaries to do their fighting for them. So Jason, as a CEO, might have been a perfect representative of the whole culture that we're dealing with here. We've talked often enough in this course about the way in which myths tend to reflect the social values of the cultures which produce them. And so here we might have another example of that. So maybe the ironic ending wouldn't have seemed out of place to the first audiences of this poem any more than in our own ironic age. You know, we can take a character like the Errol Flynn character and turn him into a slightly ironic figure, as Rob Reiner did in his movie The Princess Bride. The central character there is a sort of virtual ringer for Errol Flynn, and he's also a hero, but the movie refuses to take him quite seriously. It treats him a little bit ironically, as this poem does Jason. Jason is still a hero by any definition we wish to use, but maybe the age that recorded the most famous version of his story was just ironic enough to understand the story as about one who achieved a great deal, but then betrayed the person to whom he owed the most and suffered some grievous consequences as a result. Finally, as we did with Gilgamesh back in Lecture 22, I want to take a look at some of the ways in which this myth seems to look back to an earlier world, which would have been dominated not by sky gods like Zeus and Indra and Shamash, but by the goddess, who has by this time been overwritten, downgraded, pushed to the margins in a patriarchal culture like that of Greece. I'll be following an introduction to this poem by Donna Rosenberg in a book called World Mythology, an anthology of great myths and epics, because she sees this poem as showing some of the ways in which the goddess has been downgraded and marginalized. We can see this in a variety of ways in this poem. Jason is told, before he arrives at Colchis, that Medea serves Hecate, a night-wandering goddess. That is, Medea is already established, identified as a priestess. Rosenberg thinks that originally, in an earlier version of this story, Medea would have been a goddess herself. And we can tell that she might have been a goddess herself by what else Jason is told about her as he's on his way to Colchis. We are told that she can manipulate all herbs that grow on land and sea. She can call forth blazing fires and floods. She can make spring flowers grow in wintertime, and she opens the grain for ripening, and that she can make the sun and the moon change places in the sky. She sounds very much like those goddesses we looked at from earlier ages. Those earlier goddesses, we remember, were manifest in 3 stages. As the goddess of the underworld, she controls the 3 stages of life: birth and childhood, maturity and reproduction, and old age and death. As the goddess of vegetation, she controls the 3 seasons: spring with its rebirth, summer with its period of growth and harvest, and winter, the period of death and dormancy. We also remember that she was a moon goddess who appears in her 3 stages of new and waxing, full, and then waning moon and darkness. In the goddess cultures, as we learn from books like Fraser's The Golden Bough, young males competed for the right to become the consort of the priestess who represents the goddess. The tasks that these young candidates were put through included such things as wrestling with a bull, plowing a field, exactly the kind of tasks that the king of Colchis sets Jason. The consort, and we remember going through this when we were in our unit on the gods and goddesses, the consort, having served his year and thus assured another year of fertility, would be sacrificed. His body would sometimes be dismembered and perhaps even in early days eaten by the priestess, who would thus gather his powers of fertility to themselves. 9 months later in lambing season, the spirit of the sacrificed king would be reborn in those infants. Later, as we've seen, what happens is a mock king was killed in place of the king himself, or there was a ritual death and a ritual rebirth so that the king could stay around, the consort could stay around for a period of time longer than 1 year. We saw back in Lecture 13, for example, that in Zimbabwe the time span was 4 years based on the myth of Mwezi and his 2 wives. In this myth, Medea cuts up Jason and puts him in a cauldron of herb-steeped water and then restores him. And this all looks so much like a reflection of those earlier vegetation myths, those rituals of an earlier age in which the consort dies and is resurrected. Here, he is dismembered, and we've seen ample opportunities or ample examples of that. He is dismembered, he is put into the cauldron, and then he is resurrected. And so that all of these myths, of course, would have been reinterpreted and rewritten by the time we get to the 3rd century BCE. But Rosenberg thinks that just beneath this story, we can see hints of that older story still being told. Also at the end, Medea's banishment from Corinth. In some versions, she's also later on going to be banished from Athens, where she runs when she leaves Corinth, may suggest, Rosenberg thinks, the expulsion of the goddess from patriarchal Greek culture. We can see this partly in the way that serpents are handled in this myth. In the goddess age, the snake was a symbol of rejuvenation and immortality, since it shed its skin and then grew a new one. It was almost always associated with the goddess, and her chariot was frequently pulled by serpents in the form of dragons. Dragons are simply very large serpents. In the ending of Euripides' play here, Medea escapes in a chariot drawn by dragons, but now the chariot and the dragons belong not to Medea, but to Helios, the sun god, who loans it to her. By this time, snakes have become ambiguous symbols, and they have been turned over to males, presumably, who are able to control them. It's maybe significant that in this myth that it should be the sun god who loans her the serpents and the chariot, because as we've seen, sun gods were sometimes the ones who replaced the goddess when that transition took place. At least it's always a sky god. Euripides' play was in its own day a very stunning and politically incorrect defense of women and aliens. He allows us to understand why Medea would do what she does, and even to some extent to sympathize with her, despite the terrible things that she does. At one point in this, toward the end of Euripides' play, the chorus sits down to talk about what it's like to be a woman in 5th century Athens. This is, of course, where the play was first written. And they say that being a woman is much, much harder in so many ways than being even a warrior on the front lines of battle. In Gilbert Murray's translation, the beginning of this lament for what a woman's life is like, the first line reads, "A reed most bruised is woman," and that speech in the Gilbert Murray translation became one of the anthems of the suffragette movement. So that there's a great deal of sympathy here on the part of Euripides for what it felt like to be a woman in 5th century BC Athens, particularly as in the case of Medea when she is an alien and has no real legal rights of her own. All this from Euripides' play is on a kind of contemporary political level. Rosenberg says that, yes, that's all true, but if we look beneath the surface of the myth, we can perhaps see outlines of the old goddess culture and some of the ways in which it gets set aside. Medea becomes, typically in such cases as we've seen, a femme fatale, a dangerous woman who needs to be marginalized, suppressed, and restrained so that the masculine order can succeed. That Euripides didn't quite buy this reading is one of the reasons why Euripides in his own day was the least popular playwright of the big three. it also may explain why he's the most popular of the big three in our time. That's the story of Jason and the Argonauts and the story of Medea. We have been working over the last several lectures with a kind of simplified and schematic monomyth, and we've looked at some of the ways in which Gilgamesh, King Arthur, and Jason illustrate it. Next time, we're going to take a closer look at the details of that monomyth, especially as it's explicated by two of its most famous theorists, Otto Rank and Joseph Campbell. And in the lecture after that, we'll use those as our templates to look at an African epic poem about a hero named Window. That's our next two lectures.